So for the core principles of strength and conditioning, we need to know some key terms. Progressive overload being the first one. Progressive overload states fundamentally that your workouts need to get harder over time. Where a lot of people can take this the wrong direction is they will take it simply to say, I need to always add reps or load, etc. And if I'm not adding reps or load over time, the workout is not effective. And that's a misapplication of progressive overload. The way you should think about progressive overload is simply that by nature of you getting stronger or more muscle, more reps will be done or more load will be added to the bar. So it's rather a consequence rather than like causative. So it's not like you're growing muscle and strength because you put the load on the bar and did that extra rep. It's you did a stimulative workout and got muscle size and muscle strength, and that's going to allow you in the future to work a little bit harder at the same relative effort. So it's don't put the cart before the horse, I guess. Don't think you need to go into the gym every single day and add 5 pounds to the bar. That's not necessarily the worst strategy if you're using a progressive volume method, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But go in there, work in a stimulative rep range with a stimulative amount of volume, somewhere between 10 to 20 sets on average is a good starting place for most people, and go appropriately close to failure, at somewhere between 3 and 0 reps from failure, and you'll have stimulative work. And then eventually over time, to maintain that level of relative effort, more reps will be done, more volume will be done, more load will be done. And that's one of the reasons why we use a logbook, is so that you can ultimately know that over time and know that you're progressing and not just standing still. Did I beat last week? Did I not? Etc. Another way that you might not think about to progressively overload is actually form improvements. So as you improve form over time, that can be a way that you're getting more stimulus to the target muscle, which is the goal specifically of hypertrophy training. In strength training, it's more about the physical skill of being able to exert strength, but it's still relevant to know that as you improve form, you're getting more stimulus to the target muscle and then more muscle growth, which is relevant for a lot of athletes. So specificity has a few applications here. Essentially, you want to train the thing you want to get. So what we mean by that is if you want to get a bigger bench press, the most specific thing you can do is a bench press. And exercise science is kind of built off of this principle. Where people can go wrong is over-apply this and think, oh, I better only bench press. And that's a misapplication. There's a whole slew of exercises that can be specific to what you're trying to build. And then also, you need to understand that part of a strength and conditioning coach's job is to give them in the weight room things that benefit their sport, that are specific to their sport, that they don't get in their sport or don't get in high enough volumes in their sport. So for instance, a soccer player might get we'll go basketball player. A basketball player is going to get a lot of like sub-maximal jumps, and they might take 1 maximal jump or 2 maximal jumps when they're really trying to dunk over someone. That's not enough maximal plyometric effort to optimally increase jump height. It will increase jump height, but it's not optimal. So one of the things you need to give them in the gym is something that they're not getting in the sport. So you would be doing max effort stuff. So that's something you need to keep in mind as a strength and conditioning coach. Also, specificity is related to the muscles being trained, but also the energy systems and the movement patterns. So a comical misapplication of this would be the NFL Combine bench press test, where they see how many reps that they can do with 225. That tells me almost nothing about what that football player is capable of outside of they're generally endurant in the bench press with a reasonable amount of strength. If you look at someone coming off the line, they need to do roughly about 4 seconds of maximal pushing. So a much more applicable test in this instance, a much more specific test, would be like a set of 3 reps on the bench press. That tells me a lot more about what that lineman can do. So it needs to train the muscle groups, the movements, and or the energy systems. You can over-apply it by only thinking that those movements are the only things that you need to do. And you can under-apply it by avoiding key movements that are completely unrelated to their sport. So thinking about the bench press test using the NFL Combine. Some key terms that we need to lay down. Volume, when we talk about it, is going to be total weekly sets, and this is going to be roughly the key driver of hypertrophy as we talk about it. Intensity or load, this is going to be the key driver of strength, and this is going to be how much load's on the bar, how much weight. Speed, or how quickly you can move the weight or your body in space. This is going to be one of the key drivers of power development. And with strength and power, those are skills. So if you're not showing off the skill at a high level, you're probably not developing the skill. Meaning, if you're so fatigued that you can only lift 70% of your 1RM with not the amount of reps that you should have gotten, you're probably not getting much stronger. You need to rest, make sure you're fresh, and then you can show off those skills, explosive or be strong, and those are the things that are going to develop it. This is why strength and power training come earlier in the program, and when you're more fresh versus hypertrophy training, we can just kind of beat you into the ground. Reps in reserve, that's how many repetitions you have left until total muscular failure. So like the bar physically stops moving. Percent 1RM, this is just the amount of load that's on the bar as a relative percentage to your 1RM max. So if you could lift 100 pounds for 1RM and you put on your 70% 1RM, that'd be 70 pounds. So now let's talk about order of operations for hypertrophy a little bit. This is not a definitive list, but it's something that works really well, so you might want to give it a try. When you're working with an athlete or a client, first determine frequency. How many days can they get in the gym? How many days does the coach give you the sporting team? If it's a Gen Pop person, whatever number they tell you, because they're probably pretty highly motivated to come see you, I recommend reducing that by 1. So if they're like, I can for sure stay 5 days a week, give them 4, because it's more important that they stay consistent with it over the course of a year. You don't want to burn them out. And then the sports coach might be like, well, I'll give you 4 days. So then that kind of shows you your constraint, and then from there, you can start talking about exercise selection and frequency of training muscle groups. So within that 4 days a week, we know that hitting a muscle group more than 1 time a week is more effective, and there's a diminishing return. So we know we want at least 2, if not 3 on priority muscle groups. So what does that leave us for most people? In this instance, with 4 days a week, I highly prefer upper, lower. It ensures that you hit most things on 2 days a week, which is very beneficial. You could also consider that if you're increasing frequency and the volume is staying the same, you're going to be more fresh for each of those individual sets, meaning that you can give a higher effort and get a little bit more out of them. Think about how gassed you are in your 10th set versus your first set. So if you take a 10-set workout, set number 10 is going to be garbage. But then if you split it in 5 and 5, now all of a sudden the relative quality of those sets goes up, which is pretty cool. Now, when you want to select exercises after you've determined your frequency and kind of how often you want to hit your priority muscle groups, I recommend starting with compounds and filling those in a highly specific way, and that making up a majority of your program. It's got a lot of stimulus to the full body. It'll grow a lot of muscle and build a lot of strength, and it has a high degree of support carryover. So that's why we tend to use them a lot. Once you have all of your specific compounds thrown in, then you can kind of see where you still have volume or recovery resources that you want to allocate. So let's say you can recover from 100 weekly sets total body, because that systemic limit does exist. Excuse me. But you've got in deadlifts, high bar back squats, like you're pretty much at that recovery ceiling, but you still need more biceps. Well, you probably aren't going to throw in like bent rows, Pendlay rows, but you might throw in strict bicep curls because there's going to be less overall fatigue because it's an isolation movement and much more specific to growing biceps if that's an interest to you. So think of those as kind of like the fillers. They're amazing and they're very specific, but you use them as targeted interventions to grow the areas you want to grow the most or improve in the areas you want to grow the most for a little bit less fatigue. And one of the reasons why you wouldn't use those permanently is a time sensitive thing. So if you isolated everything, you would be in the gym for like 40 hours. Okay, so now we have our exercises, rep ranges anywhere between 5 and 30, as long as it's relatively close to failure inside of like 4 to 3 RIR is going to be really, really beneficial. and we have our split and our exercises, and we're good to go. Now we need to start thinking about how we're going to determine our starting volume. There's a few options. One is going to be the minimum effective dose model, which is you start with the set count that gets you the first detectable amount of an adaptation, whether that be strength or growth, but no more. So you start really, really light. One of the benefits of this is you're probably going to be highly sensitive to growth or strength increases when you're first coming off of a break of some sort and you're starting a program. So you might not need to push it that hard. Second, because you're starting something new, injury risk might be a smidge higher. So you might do well to start a little bit lighter. There is a preprint review by Data Driven Strength that shows this is roughly around 4 to 6 sets per week per muscle group. So that's, if you need to estimate it, that's a good place to start. But another way you can tell if you're at MEV is measuring if you got a muscular pump, which is that blood flow stiff feeling in the muscle, disruption, which is weakness in the target muscle. So if you do like a set of leg press and you get off the leg press, and to be able to hold yourself up, you have to kind of like lean on the leg press. That's a pretty good indicator that you have some disruption. That's a pretty good indicator that you've hit your minimum effective volume for that session, and you can rest until your next session, kind of repeat, and that will determine your starting weekly volume, especially if delayed onset muscle soreness is around 0 to 2 days. You're kind of in that sweet spot. Week to week, you want to look at performance as your main indicator. So are you able to match or beat performance either via reps or load? Again, this is not something you're forcing. This is something that shows us that the volume that we've chosen is stimulated enough to cause adaptation, which is really, really valuable. Also, another thing to start with the MEV model is starting roughly around 3 reps in reserve. This is for the same reasons as we mentioned previously. So that's week 1 kind of covered. How you would actually add volume to this? You add reps and load by beating a comparable sets, like Monday, week 1, set 1, Monday, week 2, set 2, match or beat. That's kind of the goal there. How you actually add volume to this is you look at performance and soreness. So if you beat performance comically and then you did not have any soreness, consider adding volume. If you just barely beat, and probably somewhere around 1 to 3 sets. If you just barely beat your performance, or if soreness was quite high and barely resolved, add little to no sets. And then if you're not beating performance or you're degrading, let's assign volumes too high. In the same way, if you have overlapping soreness, which means you might need to reduce volume a little bit. Now you know MEV, or now you know where to start, which is minimum effective volume, how to add sets, how to progress daily and weekly, so adding reps and load. And then from there, you would progress all the way up until you have back-to-back workouts where you can't match or beat performance. This tells us that you're not recovering and that you've surpassed the most amount of volume that you can do and still recover. So this is a pretty good time for you to consider a deload, because systemically your body is going to be a little bit overreached. You do not have to be married to a 7-day deload. 3 to 7 days where you're taking most of the time away from the gym and hitting maybe some active recovery sessions is going to be a really good way to drop that fatigue and kind of actualize those gains that you've been making over the past 4, 5, 6 weeks, which tend to be a good length of time for a mesocycle. Over time in this model also, you'll notice, or you'll want to decrease reps in reserve as you go on. So week 1 might be 3 reps in reserve. Week 2 might be 2 reps in reserve. Week 1 might be 1 rep in reserve. Last week is going to be failure. This is a really awesome way to ensure that you're really putting in a high amount of effort in your sets, because if you programmed it as a failure week and you get 4 more reps than what you were anticipating, that shows you may have been sandbagging it in previous weeks. A few things to note about fatigue though. If you are locally fatigued, the target muscle will fail or underperform. You can deload the active muscle or that local muscle. You do this by taking the session off of that muscle, but you can train the rest of the body accordingly. And you can do that for 1 to 2 sessions. Systemic fatigue is that total body fatigue where you're globally underperforming. You may also know things like mood disturbances and an inability to think as clearly if you've kind of surpassed this. So that's one of the ways that you run that. So that was the MEV-MRV progressive model for putting together a hypertrophy phase. There is one option that I quite like to use. Eric Helms calls it the dual progression model. But the premise of this model, where the other one is like heavy additions of sets based off of performance and autoregulation, this one is just more chronic high volume with more fine-tuned volume adjustments. So where you start your volume is an estimate of maximum adaptive volume, or the place at which you grow muscle optimally, or just a high amount of volume that you know you can tolerate. So let's say, actually a perfect example, I know that my triceps tend to give out around the 20 sets per week mark. And if I do that for too long, I know that I'll start to get some elbow pain. So I might plot my tricep volume at like 15 sets a week, as an example. Versus back, I know I can push roughly 30 sets a week. So I might put that closer to 25. And again, this is also relevant to your goals. So keep that in mind. And you still want to do that relative ease in week 1, like RARs of 3, and that's just for an injury preventative standpoint. But for the most part, this sticks around 2 to 0 RAR, 2 to 1 being kind of the mainstay in this instance. You're going to select a rep range for the movements that you're doing. So let's use an 8 to 12 rep range in this example. And you're going to add load week to week, or that's kind of the goal. You're going to add reps rather week to week until you outgrow your rep range. So like week 1, I do 9 reps. Week 2, I'm able to get 10. Week 3, I'm able to get 11. Week 4, I'm stuck at 11. That's fine. Again, you don't have to add reps every week. Reps come as a symptom of the adaptation that you're getting. Week 4, I get 12 reps. When I touch the top end of that rep range, I add a little bit of load, and that knocks me back down to that bottom end of my rep range. So now I'm doing 8, but for 5 pounds more. This is a great example, or a great way to do this. So that kind of flow chart, autoregulate, takes care of itself. If you're not adapting, that's a sign that the volume isn't stimulative enough for you in some way. So it could be that you're doing too much and you're overtraining and you're not recovering, and that's why you can't match or beat. Or you're underdoing the volume and you need to up the dose a little bit. And this is usually pretty obvious to tell. Do your workouts feel like a breeze, or are you getting kicked in the face every time you step in the gym? You can kind of use that heuristic. You add volume, provided that you're not doing too much, when performance starts to aggressively slow. And this will be a much smaller amount of volume, and it'll be less frequent that you have to add this volume because we're kind of chronically staying at that high volume mark. Eventually, when you go back to this well of adding volume, fatigue is going to aggressively outpace the volume progressions, or the strength and rep progressions that you're able to make. And this is a sign that you might be a little bit systemically overreached, and this might be when you take that full body deload. Again, 3 to 7 days, active recovery work. You could also consider taking the time fully off of the gym, but active recovery work might be a little bit better. Now, this might happen longer than the previous model, because in the MEV-MRV model, we're specifically shooting to overreach and go beyond our recoverable volume. In this model, we're not doing that, so you might find these mesocycles last a little bit longer. One cool benefit about this is this model allows you to locally deload underperforming muscle groups a little bit easier. So instead of having to slam the volume up over the course of the whole program, I might notice that my quads are underperforming. Deload quads that session, start my next session on, let's say, Monday to Thursday. If my quads are good to go and feeling good and I'm beating performance again, that was enough of a deload. If not, they need a second session. So you can deload the local muscle by simply just taking the rest of that session off that muscle. It's pretty cool. And those are going to be much more frequent of what happens. And then eventually you'll get to that place where the volume addition causes fatigue to ramp up so high relative to the gains that you're making. That's a sign we need to just shut the whole thing down, take a deload. The literature on deloading is kind of mixed. We had a big Gregorian calendar bias, like everyone would just deload 7 days. It's probably not needed, and it's probably not needed to necessarily always schedule them. In the MEV-MRV model, we schedule them because we overreach. In this model, we're going to use basically kind of like performance and fatigue is like the driving metric. And you might find it's like in beginners, it might be like 12 weeks before they need a deload. In advanced athletes, it might be closer to 4. And then you sprinkle in local muscle deloads in between there. Some common traps that you can fall into: overly long warm-ups, following the ramp protocol, raise the body temperature, activate the target muscle, and potentiate the target muscle, which is going to be lifting a load heavy enough to kind of get the nervous system in the muscle ready for your working sets. That's going to be all you need to do. So like if it's a leg day and squats are your first exercise, 2 or 3 elevating load squats, getting closer to the work weight you're going to be working with on that day, is going to be close to enough. Especially if you keep on some clothing to get the body temperature elevated, or if you did some like walking or treadmill or something to get that body temperature elevated, you're going to be ticking the box. What you don't need to do is like a 20-minute warm-up with infinite modalities. You're likely just wasting a lot of time unless you have specific, really exotic needs. And then, yeah, hopefully that helps. This is kind of the 2 methods that are really, really beneficial for putting together hypertrophy training. And then from there, we can kind of hopefully dive in a little bit deeper into programming and physiology and kind of what's actually happening under the hood.